So, Chris, welcome to the podcast, and welcome to all of you hopping on to listen in um, on this conversation about uh, Chris's new book, which I've had the pleasure of a sneak peek at a few weeks ago. Chris, tell us what your book is, and maybe we can start by you explaining the title.
Yeah, well, it's a collection of sermons and homilies, and it's divided up into most of these, almost all of them, have been preached since I was consecrated, which is almost exactly 2 years now. And so it's a kind of footprint for preaching as a bishop. That's some of what it is. Um, the title comes from a Charles Peguy poem, and the image in the poem, those who don't know, he's a French poet, like a stunning figure, dies very young, does kind of remarkable work, kind of unforgettable work on lots of fronts, and then dies young in war. But he has this image of the tree, the knot on the tree that forms and starts to weep before life bursts forth, the life of the new blossoms. And in the poem, the line, in translation anyway, the line is, all life comes from tenderness. And yeah, it's stayed with me. I mean, I don't remember when I first read it, but I think almost all the time, the way it is in which you get this kind of ugly knot, this knottedness that begins to weep, and then from that place comes life. That seems to me to be the truth of things, right? That out of ugliness and knottedness, once there are tears and that tenderness that comes with tears, you have the possibility for growth and change. And so, like, one of the sermons that comes up with sermons quite a bit for me, but
Mhm.
one of the sermons in this section is titled, has that title, and it seemed appropriate one for the collection as well. And that's, yeah, in some ways, this whole collection is a way of honoring that poem and honoring that line and that image from that poem.
That reminds me of a comment that you make in the introduction to the book, where you talk about the importance of, or um, how often it is that a preacher will get up in the pulpit, um, you know, with kind of feeling overwhelmed, hurting, having life happen to them, and you make the point that it's important to speak straightforwardly from that place. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think this is really hard to do well.
Yeah.
It's where you don't center yourself. You're not bleeding on the congregation. You're not doing therapy by making them listening to you. You're not putting them on the couch, so to speak. You're letting them stay in the views, but you're also human. And I think there are degrees of vulnerability, and it's possible to be exposed in a way that would be, at least usually, would be wrong.
Hmm.
If you're pastoring people over time, there are just going to be moments when the only way to tell the truth is to let them see a bit of the truth of your experience. And I think that that's a matter of touch. It's a matter of degree. You want to expose yourself and put them in a place that is burdening, wrongly burdening, but you also don't want to hide yourself. I mean, I'm always been really impressed with Paul's reading of the Moses and the veiling story,
Hmm.
and I've understood it differently. I mean, I think at different seasons of my life that story reads differently, but it's such a stunning read. 2 Corinthians 3, Paul says, "We are not like Moses, who veiled his face to keep the people from seeing the glory fade." And if you go back and read the narrative, that that's not quite what the narrative says. That's that's a that's quite a creative, interpretive move on Paul's part. I think a legitimate one, but still a creative one, and tells you a lot about, first of all, the kind of lability of those texts, what they yield, what they're capable of yielding, but also about what Paul's concern is as a pastor. And he's telling the Corinthians, we are not hiding our faces. Like, we're letting you see who we are. We're not like the super apostles who are
Mhm.
veiling themselves in order to have an appearance. I mean, ironically, they want to make themselves come off a certain way. They're controlling their image, managing their image, and they do that by hiding their face. But we, Paul says, my ministry team and I, we don't do that. Like, we let you see who we are. And with unveiled faces, we behold the glory of God and are changed from glory to glory. And I think that is about transparency and vulnerability. That's not exposure, right? It's
Yeah.
the face that's being seen. And I I think, again, that's delicate. It's has to be, you have to meet it in the moment in exactly the right way. It's easy to do it the wrong way, too much or too little, but it still has to be done, especially if you're going to pastor people over long stretches. They
Yeah,
they
I
have
was,
to.
like Jesus' line about my sheep know my voice.
Mm.
So yeah, it's not just that the preacher gets to know his or her congregation over time. It's they get to know him or her. Um, and I've listened to some of your preaching from after you had your stroke, and it occurred to me earlier this year when my cancer came back, and everybody knows it, so it would be weird not to speak from that place.
That's right. And again, I think it's and I've certainly made mistakes in both directions. Trying to not talk about it when everybody's thinking about it is one problem. Trying to talk about it too much can create a different kind of problem. But I think the most important thing, you just got to be comfortable with that is part of what you're saying anytime you get up to talk. When you have whatever's going on in your life, you're bringing it with you. And there's going to be a smell or a feel that the people who know you and love you, who've been there, and maybe people who just are seeing you for the first time but are intuitive, they're going to pick up on it. They're going to know. It's it. If there's chaos around you, chaos has a smell to it, has a feel to it, and that can be internal turmoil. It can be turmoil in your family, and it might not be anything that you're responsible for. You haven't created it, and you can't fix it, but you're living through it, and so you're going to bring that. And I think there's just an appropriate degree of openness that either whether you speak to it directly or not, you're comfortable knowing that they know, and you're not trying to hide that or manage your image in some way. But
And that's
also
all.
without putting it. I mean, that's the other side of this is that there is a way of pitying yourself in front of people,
Mhm.
which does not work, and I think is important not to do.
And that's because all of this is tied up in another comment you make in the introduction. The introduction itself is worth the book, where you talk about people asking you about sermon preparation, and you say that it starts with wanting nothing but what God wills to say.
Yes.
I think it's so obvious, but I don't know that we think of it.
No, I mean, honestly, I think my own experience, both personally and as a teacher and as a pastor of pastors, is that most of us who are preachers feel like we have to have a sermon. The preparation begins with what's the most clever, interesting thing I can think of to say this week, and we're kidding ourselves if that's not where most of us start. Like, what's interesting me most, or what do I think people will find most interesting, or will make me look the best as a preacher. And as understandable as that is, it you can't live from that place, and other people can't live from that place. You can't nurture people from just every week having something clever to say or something that's interesting. I mean, our goal is not to be interesting.
Mm.
Our goal is to feed people, right? Our goal is to shepherd them. Our goal is to do the will of God and to speak the word of God. And that's not always going to be the most interesting thing you can think of. Now, I think in the long run, in the big picture, yeah, that's going to be interesting. And it certainly it should never be dull. Not if it's really touched me. It should never just be boring because there's no life in it. But I won't be able to find to that if I'm just looking for the thing that interests me or that I think others might find interesting.
So, I was thinking, I recently read a review that you wrote of Philip Carey's The Meaning of Protestant Theology, and I thought it was quite good. Um, because I'm in a different place now than I was when I first read it, and so I appreciated your pushback. And it reminded me of I guess preached at a church in California a year or two ago, and afterwards, a woman in the parking lot um, thanked me for delivering the gospel to her. And what she meant precisely was that she heard me say um, that she was forgiven on account of Christ's death.
Mm.
So like that was the gospel, and she heard it, and all these other words. Um, and now I'm like looking back, I'm like, well, that's not right. So talk about what it means to preach the gospel. Um, by way of kind of Robert Jensen.
Yeah. So I think I might say it a little differently now than he did, but I think it is what he was saying. He talked a lot about preaching that opens the future, that orients us to the future. And in some ways, I think that language is a little dated now. I'm not
Mhm.
sure how it's heard. But
Yeah,
what he's saying
I've got the
is,
futurist option here on my desk, actually.
there you go, yes. But I think his point, I mean, he's picking up language that at the time was, you know, all the rage. Point of it is preaching that's true, preaching that's good, preaching that is gospel opens you up to God and the life that God wills for you. And I think there's a way in which that's more caught than taught. It's more felt than articulated. It has it has an effect on people first in their guts, their bones, and I'm thinking of the story you told of the woman who came up to you after. I wonder if we had the chance to talk to her, if we had a chance to ask follow up questions, if perhaps she was hearing in you and from you a word that was actually freeing, that was actually liberating toward the future, to use Jensen's language. But the only way she knew to talk about it as gospel was to connect to that
Okay.
phrase.
Yeah. Hmm.
There may be a way in which, yes, it's also possible, right, that she reduced her sermon down to that kind of formula, and that would be wrong. But sometimes I think people sense more than they can say, and then they're just looking for phrases to hang what they're sensing on. And so I wonder, in her case, it might have been she did hear the gospel. That's all she knew to refer to it as. That's the only language she had, but she actually was sensing something bigger and
What?
truer.
One of the things I appreciate about these sermons and your sermons generally, is so, and you put it explicit, here that, um, you know, we mustn't treat the Old Testament as a burden that Jesus frees us from. And then you don't say it explicitly, but you do it in a way that I appreciate. Um, you, you don't present Jesus in your preaching as someone who rescues us from the burden of being Christians.
Mm. Mm. Yes, I mean, I do think, I mean, here my debts to Howard Ross are, I hope, are obvious, and not him alone, but he's the one I learned it from first. I mean, I wouldn't have found Jensen without him, and so many others. But I think this sense in so much of our preaching, explicitly or implicitly, we're using the Old Testament as contrast material for the new. All right, so this is the material you need to know how bad it could have been and how bad it would be if it weren't for Jesus.
Mhm.
And then that by extension becomes a way of talking about religion in general and Christianity in particular. And so we end up communicating. And interestingly, this works whether you're in progressive circles or conservative circles, whether you are in high church or low church settings, that kind of no matter what corner of the church you're in, this language comes through, at least in Protestant circles, that Jesus is rescuing us from obedience, the way of life God has called us to live, from the law. And, I mean, that it's not only wrong, I mean, it is terribly wrong, but it also is its own kind of burden that is unbearable. It's all framed as liberation, but it's actually just disorientation and confusion. And the long term effect of it is we we're not doing the will of God, and so we're more and more entangled in trying to figure out what to do, how to live. And I think I it's there in Bonhoeffer, but it took me years to see it clearly that all that matters is doing the will of God. That's all that matters for any of us. And preaching is one of the ways in which Christ guides us into that knowing and doing. Do this, and then you will know how to live. Like, do the truth, and the truth will set you free. And preaching is meant to be in service of that. Here's the will of God. I just taught a class on Bonhoeffer's ethics, and I was sharing with the students how remarkably clear he is. This is the work of preaching in pastoral care. You help people identify the will of God for their
Hmm.
lives.
Hmm.
And that's not vague, but it's also not general.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
There are no general guidelines. There is the living Lord and you. He means for you to live a certain way and to do certain things and to take up certain responsibilities.
It
And
makes
you
me so twitchy to see people, Christians on social media, using Bonhoeffer for one size fits all exhortations. Like, you haven't actually read him. You haven't read him.
word exactly that there are no principles, and he makes the point explicitly in ethics that if you are teaching principles, you are suggesting that your interpretation of those principles and your capacity to apply them is greater than the principles themselves, that you are the living judge. You're the actual shepherd. And you're just, Christ is resourcing you. And he says, no, Christ is the shepherd. And your job is to to say his word and to hear the words of those who are you're speaking to. So for Bonhoeffer, the, the work of the preacher is the work of the pastor that begins in listening and listening to people in such a way that you hear them out. You hear them until they are able to confess their sins. Then you begin to speak the word of forgiveness and mercy. And then in the sermon, you declare the word of the Lord that guides them into the concrete specifics of their own obedience. And that's going to each parishioner. Like, again, there's no generalizations here. I mean, you can generalize like love your neighbor, but that's not a principle. Like, that has to be worked out for you and for me and for each one of us day to day, week to week. And he believes that the sermon is central to that. It's definitive for that. And that wouldn't be true in a lot of our congregations because the sermon is just, it's interesting, but it's also vague.
Mm.
It's memorable. And I make this point too in the introduction. The goal of the sermon is not to be memorable. I mean, sometimes people critique preaching. I only remember a few sermons. I only remember a few meals from my life, and are the ones that nearly killed me. Were really sick from them. So some of the sermons I remember best nearly killed me. But there were sermons that were sustaining me, not because they were memorable or interesting, but because they were what I needed in that moment to take that next step toward the will of God for my life. And I mean, of course, there were lots of sermons that weren't that too, but I'm indebted to a lot of sermons I have no memory of. That I have,
Mm.
as a preacher, I have to be comfortable in that role too. I have to be comfortable saying, I want to say this week what needs to be said to help these people take that next step into the will of God in their lives. And I can't have any ego riding on that.
It is freeing to get to the place where you can be like, well, I've done all I can do. Um, and it's up to God to make this happen or not.
Absolutely. And paradoxically, even humorously, I think the higher your theology of preaching, the more humbling it is for the preacher, because you really are recognizing this. I think the sermon is sacramental. I don't think you can have a higher view of preaching than I do. But I don't think that that has much to do with the preacher other than the willingness to be as truthful as you can be and to honor the text. So again, something I learned from Vincent. The most important thing is that I let people see me struggling with what the texts are saying, and that I'm truthful enough that what the Lord is saying in those texts comes through to them.
Hmm.
That often means that the sermon is doing work that's working against the grain of the work I'm doing. And all I'm doing is essentially providing the counterpoint to what the texts are saying, and people can recognize what the Lord is saying, even though I'm not able to quite find the words for it. And so in and around my words, which come up short, which I mean they always come up short, but sometimes shorter than others, then there's still a way in which the word gets said. So I think we need if we had a more sacramental theology of preaching, we would have fewer preachers thinking they were doing too much.
Yeah.
Um,
And one of the comments you make in the introduction too that's important is the congregation are not those who receive the gospel from the preacher; they are the form the gospel takes. Say a little bit about that.
yeah, so like recognizing that the congregation is the actor, it's not the preacher. I saw a liturgy once, a rubric that referred to the minister's worship service. That was a phrase in the rubric. The minister is worship service. And it's one of those mistakes that's astonishingly illuminating that that's what we think, right? That this is his worship service. And it does turn into the worship of him,
Mm.
the phrase suggests. But it's not the minister's work. It's our work. I mean, I'm not going to say it because everybody says it, but that popular definition of what the liturgy is, I mean, that's true. The congregation is doing the work here, but the work that's getting done is the work of God. We must work the works of God, as Jesus says.
Hmm.
And that means doing the will of God right here, right now. This congregation, this gathering of people, the will of God needs to be done and can only be done fully when they, as a congregation, enact what is being called out of them, called forth from them by the sermon. And the now again, I'm with Bonifer on this. Like the sermon cannot work like that apart from a congregation that's gathered and cared for by a shepherd. So I think the pastoral office, there's a lot of work to be done there. And most of that effort is in praying for those people. And that's where most of the effort is, not leadership. Most of the effort is in bearing them and carrying them in your heart, in your prayer, and then listening well enough to hear them, to help them find their own words for what it is God is doing in them. And and preaching should arise out of that kind of prayer and that kind of listening. When it does, when it does that work and it forms a congregation, not just individuals, but a congregation who then become together that will inflesh in the world, right? The incarnation continues. The project of Pentecost continues in them. And this is, of course, at the of the local church. I think we this is how God chooses to work in the world. It's not all that God does by any means. I don't think that the work of the Spirit is somehow limited to what the churches are doing, but there is a work of God that's happening there in our gathering and in our life shared congregationally that is unique. That is an an absolutely essential aspect of the way in which the kingdom of God comes in the world.
So, um, you note that one of the themes that unites uh, your sermons, your homilies, um, is that they're sacramental. And one of the questions I have is, so you grow up in a charismatic um, tradition that doesn't have a problem believing that God is up to things in the world and in our lives. Um, and now you're in an Anglican tradition, and I don't know if the people you preach to are coming from similar backgrounds as you. Um, but on Monday night we were talking about the kind of the latent memorialist understanding of the sacraments that exists in a lot of mainline churches. Because I think of American culture, and so I'm wondering, do you do you have counsel for how to get people who think the sacraments are our act, um, and steer them uh, towards a higher view of the sacraments?
Mhm. Absolutely. I think there has to be a teaching office in the church too that is in service of preaching. So in many of our congregations, this is really difficult because we don't have enough time with people. So we only get an hour a week or so with them. And that's just not enough time to do all the work that needs to be done. So we need a catechetical teaching office in which we can talk it through with this. But I think we also need in pastoral care the kinds of conversations where we can field questions and redirect them to the sacraments. I think people have to be experiencing them for quite a long time before understanding starts to come to what it is they're experiencing. I don't think you can explain it to people who aren't doing it. So I think baptism, confession, Eucharist, these things just have to be practiced and practiced and practiced. And our teaching and catechesis can inform that. We have to field questions and answer them as best we can. But I think in preaching, it should be so integrated in us that it just kind of it comes through with the preaching over and over and over again until people start to recognize, oh, you keep saying this. What do you mean? And because I do think it's to use Richard Hayes' phrase, thinking sacramentally is a conversion of the imagination.
Mm.
I is we live in a. I mean, this is all that's about the demystification of things, the disenchantment of reality. I don't think that's quite right. I think that we weren't so much disenchanted as we became more magical. Our thinking became more magical, not less. And we when we lost touch with the sacramental, and the rise of the scientific imagination was not a triumph over superstition or over magic. It was actually the displacement of the sacramental, which was our guard against the sacrament, not sacramentality, but against superstition and against magical. And we've lost that, losing the sacramental. So most of us are thinking magically all the time, uh, and which machine think magical thinking, and only sacramental imagination can rescue us from that. That something can be what it is, and at the same time, what God wants it to be, without this in any way being less than what it is. Right? That
Hmm.
wine is bread and wine, and it's as bready as any bread and as winey as any wine, and it is the body and blood of precisely in that breadness and wine, in giving and receiving, be eaten and take. So I think we got to learn to think like that, and learning to think like that is, I think we learn it from our bodies. Then we do it with our body till our hearts and minds opened.
Um, so you mentioned sacramentality being one of the common themes. Can you? So your book is divided into four parts. Um, so we've got the way of the cross, crossing the inner threshold in the company of the saints, and contemplating the holy. Can you talk about these kind of thematic headers and what the movement of the book is you're trying to convey?
Yes, and I would love to say that I planned all this, but I think it was just accidental. But I hope that that accident was a telling accident. But I think it came out of the sermons. Although I didn't notice it until after the fact. That the way of the cross, this movement, I mean, Passover as the passive, as the going over. I think there is a movement through betrayal, suffering, death into resurrection. Like that movement through that pattern of movement shows itself over and over and over again in our lives. We're constantly making passage. The Passover is happening again and again. And I think there is a way in which that has to happen in the movement interiorly. Like I'm moving, think of, Teresa's interior castle, like there are movements in and deeper in and deeper in.
So I've been reading Carlos Era's book, They Flew.
Hmm.
Um, I'm like, how did I read The Interior Castle at UVA under David Bentley Hart, and I had no idea that she like levitated. So
Right.
there's parts of the tradition that we've just like kept down.
Well, and the reason we do that, of course, is we tend to edit out the stuff that embarrasses us. And it embarrasses us because we think it undermines the credibility of what we're reading. For a lot of people reading that text, there's a kind of highbrow academic reading that would see the levitation. Not, I wonder if they even believe it happened, but that the talk that it would happen is embarrassing because and it would undermine the credibility of this kind of interior. But this isn't going to be true of Hart, but a lot of those readings psychologize it.
Mm-hmm.
Reading her talk about the spirit and the heart, but really subtly or not so subtly shifting to a kind of psychological reading of what she's doing. And so talk about levitation would undermine that. But, I was raised as Pentecostal. So the most embarrassing parts of the church's history are we are the embarrassing family members that like we take maybe a little too much pride in that. I grew up around people who would say, I don't need to read the Interior Castle, but tell me more about this levitation.
Well, I mean, it does show up in your writing. That there are lots of weird things that we believe. So why start crossing some of them out?
Absolutely. And to think and I think leaning into the embarrassment a bit, like recognizing that there are some things to be embarrassed about, but there's no use pretending we're not. And there are some things we're embarrassed about that we ought not be. And like letting that kind of exposure happen, I think is important. But I think there's that movement in that we were just talking about, but then you also get the movement out toward the lives of the saints. And I think in order for the life of Christ to happen in me, it's going to happen in me in a way that deepens my interiority, but not without also externalizing my attention. It's going to make me more attentive to my neighbor. And it's in watching the lives of the saints and turning my eyes toward them that I learned to do that well. I mean, Rowan Williams, I think this is probably where Rowan Williams' work is strongest. It training our capacity to recognize the holy, to recognize there is holiness happening again, and how each time it happens, it's different. There is resonance. There are family resemblances, but the face of each saint is unique. Saints don't become more and more like each other the more saintly they become. They become more and more different from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And like this is I think what Williams is constantly calling us to. And his work at its best is actually a training in that. Notice this person, notice Mother Maria of Paris, and notice Teresa of Avila, notice John of the Cross, but notice Augustine too, and notice Augustine's mother, and so like constantly directing our attention back to the particularities of these people, their weirdnesses, as well as their their greatness, and contemplate that person until you can see that the holier they become, the more they differ from everyone else around them. The more at ease they are in their own body, and the more ill at ease they are in the way the world seems to be working.
Hmm.
That shows up over and over again, but it looks different every time. And I think there's something about that that's really freeing for us. And paradoxically, the more I look at the lives of the saints, the less anxious I am about the fact that I'm not a saint. And excuse the point. I get more comfortable with my sin, not comfortable with sinning, but more comfortable with the fact that I'm a sinner when I'm around people who have had their sin laid bare before God and met with mercy. And that that is gospel. That is free.
So one of the things I appreciate um, about your preaching, Chris, is that by reading and hearing you, you have made me a better reader of the scriptures. Um, you you notice things, and you notice connections. So talk a little bit about just your discipline of reading for the purpose of preaching.
Yeah. I do think this really right at the heart of preaching, and noticing things. Like that's a really good way of putting it. We should have had this conversation before I published the book. I would have put that in the introduction. But when you're paying attention, as we say, you notice things. And people who are, I mean, and this is true in any kind of any setting, anyone who really knows what they're doing, whether we could use any analogy here, sports analogy or an artist's analogy or a musician, like pick any kind of field you want. Someone who really knows what they're doing, they notice things that are just completely lost on the rest of us. That once they point them out, are right there in front of us. They were all along, but they're lost on the rest of us because we don't notice them. We can't see what's right in front of us. So there's a couple of places in the prophets. One is in Jeremiah and then another in Amos. The Lord, the first time he interacts with Jeremiah, what do you see? I see a blossom on an almond branch. And then Amos, it's even funnier because the text says, the Lord showed me a plumb line and then asked me, what do you see? I see a plumb line. And weeks ago, that was the reading. And
Mhm.
when the read that passage, he laughed just as you did just now, because it is funny. Like the Lord showed me a plumb line. Amos, what do you see? I see a plumb line. And in the homily, I said, only the prophets can see what's obvious. That's what makes them prophets. They see what the rest of us should see, but can't. And there's like preaching is mostly about noticing what's in the text. It is there. It's not about, and this is why if your goal is to be interesting or to say something memorable, you won't notice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You're
You're too busy
you're
with.
you're looking for the wrong thing. The key is, how do I slow down to what the text is actually saying until I overlooked over and over and over and over again. And the moment that happens, the moment I notice something in this text that I've read and read and read and read and didn't, I know what's. So notice what you notice.
Yeah, and
And
so I've been doing this series on the miracles of Jesus and the Tower of Siloam, or not Tower of Siloam, the pool, um, you know, the man who can't get to the water in time and it like I'm like, why have I never like Jesus is stepping over people to interact with this one person? Like, how have I've rushed through this passage and not really like seen it.
that's exactly the thing I'm talking about. So, if I were giving advice to preachers, it would be read the text, kind of acknowledge what you see at this level. That's kind of first you read through it and know that what you're seeing can't, if you see it the first time you read through it, you don't have a sermon yet.
Mm.
Those are just, you haven't seen anything yet. Read it until you notice something that was always there, but you didn't notice it. That's something that surprises you. How did I not see this? Here it is. And then notice what it brings up in you. So notice what's in the text that you didn't notice before. And then notice how that stirs your heart. What prayers and how does it and I talk about this, I think, in the introduction too. If you have nothing else to say, just say those things to the people. This is what I hear the text saying. This is what it makes me want to pray for you. That is almost certainly enough for them to know what they need to know to respond to the will of God. But I think noticing is the right word for it. And the kind of noticing of the true expert, the one who's really given her life or his life to working in this field, what in the Middle Ages is called the vineyard of the text. Like live in that text until you've learned how to be present to it in such a way that you know you're going to notice something today that you've never seen before.
Yeah,
And
Cody here says, recently noticed the possibility of a theme with Judas and Peter. Judas is in the shadow of the narrative until he's confronted by Jesus at the moment of his betrayal. And Peter is consistently confronted by Jesus. Both betray, but Peter is in the light.
see, I've never noticed that. That's a wonderful, wonderful observation there. Right? And then immediately I'm thinking, what does that bring up in me? What does that stir in me? And what kind of prayers does it bring to my heart? So that's a perfect example of what I mean. But notice how, like, our temptation as preachers is to hear something like that, and now we have something interesting to say. But I don't think that alone can sustain. I don't think that's nurturing for the congregation. I think it's interesting, it's insightful, but where it starts to nurture me and the people I'm pastoring is when I bring that insight, share it. Cody, I think you said his name was. Cody said the other day this about Peter and Judas. Just such an insight. Here's what it stirred in me for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the personalizing of it for me and for them that makes it nurturing. So that as insightful as that is, as interesting as that is, if I just reproduce it in my sermon without working it through my heart for these people, without working it through prayer, I don't think it's actually life giving. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think much of the time our preaching is a kind of plagiarizing. And plagiarism is bothersome to me, not because it breaks some academic rule, but because it isn't passing through the person. It isn't coming through the heart.
Okay, so
And
this is a perfect segue. I exist in a denomination that is historically good and bad, always ready to reach for the latest thing to grow the church. That's and so I get from denominational leaders and resources push to use AI to innovate worship planning, sermon preparation, all this. And my suspicion is that once you okay, you created permission for people to no longer do their jobs. um, and so talk a little bit, because now the danger isn't the plagiarizing of one person's work; it's the plagiarizing of an infinite number of people's works. So talk about the discipline of sitting with scripture and preparing a sermon in this new moment we're in.
yeah, I mean, this is probably going to alienate a lot of people. I need to be careful here about how it's live. You can't edit it out. Uh, I I think if you, I want to, and I want to slow down just so I don't want to be necessarily offensive, but if there isn't something in you that loves the work of preparing to preach, I don't trust you as a preacher. Like I don't. It's if you love talking to people but not preparing yourself to do it, wisely and well. I don't know, like, how trustworthy are you really? And again, if given what I'm committed to about what the sermon is supposed to be, I mean, there's a difference between being a good communicator and being a good preacher. In fact, I think great communicators are very rarely good preachers
Hmm.
because they're too accomplished as speakers to let text work on them in ways that bear witness to the word of God, in ways that nurture people. And one of the tells for that is a good communicator always leaves you intimidated at what they're able to do.
Hmm.
You kind of walk away thinking, I could never do that. And the there are times I think you need to be around people like that in order to develop craft. So it's not that there's never a place for that, but you can't nurture a congregation on that long term. Great communicators cannot pastor people. And the it's not that having that capability isn't a problem. You just have to know how to rein it in and know this is not the place for a great communication. This is a place for a sermon. And very often the sermon will be more humble than a great communication would be. And I so I think that this could err in two ways. So when I'm talking about doing the work of preparation, I don't mean putting together a great sermon, something you could show in a homiletics class and impress people with. I'm saying if your heart isn't prayerful, if you don't love reading scripture, if you don't delight in getting to partner with God and speaking life into people's lives, why are you doing this?
Hmm.
What in the world are you doing? Like, save yourself and others. Like, get out of the business. And I don't, again, I don't mean that. I don't want that to be ugly. I think a lot of people end up in ministry not because they're called, but because their habits from their family role,
Hmm.
and they fall into ministry in that way. And perhaps that falling into ministry is part of the way in which God is working redemption in their lives. So no judgments. But it's just it's I think deadly to be in a place where the work of ministry, listening to people, praying for them, soaking in the scripture, if that's not life to you, then this isn't the life for you.
There are 26 sermons in this new book. Uh, All life comes from tenderness. Is there a sermon or two that is particularly meaningful to you as the one who wrote it and delivered it?
I think, well, this isn't quite an answer to the question you just asked, but the last sermon in the book is the one that got the most responses. God is not a master.
Mm.
That is both when I gave it and since then. And when these sermons were given, most of them were given without not in manuscripted form, like they were spoken more off the cuff, as we say, and written after the fact. Some were written before and then slightly changed, but most of them were spoken and then written up after the fact.
'Cause you have that, you quote Bonhoeffer in the introduction about how the sermon's not over when the preaching is done.
So, if people find the original sermon and listen to it, it's not word for word what they're going to read in this book. But I think that sermon, I think the reason it got the response it did, I think I've preached two sermons in my life that have outsized, maybe three, that have outsized response compared to other sermons. And one of them was God is not a master. One was God is not in control, and which was a centerpiece for the Surprised by God book. And those two sermons in particular, I think the reason they got the response they did is that they touched this kind of nerve right at the center of all of our other nerves that assumes our relationship to God is a master slave relationship, and
Mhm.
that control is precisely the relationship God has to us and to all things. And if that's not true, then what else is not true? It's a kind of the the what ifs are scary, I think, for people. But I think at the same time, anyone who knows the Lord, anyone who's walked with the Lord at all, anyone who has any sense of goodness, the moment they hear that, the moment they have permission to say out loud that that can't be true, they know it. They're ready to say it because it isn't actually how God is experienced, because it isn't who God is, and it isn't actually what Scripture says, and it isn't actually what the tradition teaches, and it's not what we see in the lives of the saints. It's just so saturated. Our language is so saturated with talk of control and mastery and obedience is slavery that it's shocking to us when we hear anything else. I
It's a good
think probably point to.
I mean, you mentioned we only have an hour or two with people a week. And that's a good reminder that we don't have more time with them, but Christian culture sometimes does. It's one of the things I think oftentimes we're preaching against is other quote unquote Christian things that people hear that, it's in the ether, it's on the internet, it's on social media.
I mean, in some ways, that's the whole job. It's a and to learn to do it well. Like, so there's a way of doing that that gets a lot of attention, but isn't very effective. So like, and I've made this mistake so many times. And if anybody heard me preach, you've heard me make this mistake many times, where my conflict with what they're used to hearing, it's so direct that it generates interest. But now they're distracted by my willingness to say something so directly against what they're expecting to hear that it isn't actually getting access to their heart. It's just a kind of, oh wow, so he's going there. He's willing to say that. And notice that's about me. And this is not coming from some sense of, Midwestern politeness, like I shouldn't have attention on me. I don't mean that. I'm not talking about that at all. I mean the sermon should work on people in subtler ways than that. And if I'm drawing attention by being too controversial, the problem is not, oh no, they're looking at me. I mean, I don't mean that. I'm saying the problem is it can't kind of work on them in the ways that the truth is supposed to work on them
Mm.
because they're thinking about it, and that provides a kind of distancing, right? And there are times to be shocking, and I think those who are really good at preaching, and again, I'm holding that distinction between great communicators and good preachers, but are often shocking. But the way good preaching works on us is that shock is only ever preparation for something else to get at us. The shocking thing itself is not what changes. It's what it opens us up to. So like the shock is the dynamite exploding so that we can mine. And it's not itself life-giving. It's quick. And there's a time for shock, for sure. But if all I'm ever doing is shocking, then I'm just a showman. I'm not a preacher. I'm not a pastor. I'm not actually caring for people. I'm just an entertainer. And preaching shouldn't be dull. I mean, again, Howard West is right. Preaching shouldn't be dull, but it shouldn't just be explosive either, right?
Yeah.
I'm always here to blow things up. And yeah, I mean, we could talk forever about that, but I think to your original question, I'm far afield from it now, but to your original question, yes, we could be contradicting it. And sometimes that contradiction has to be correct. But I think the most effective contradiction is they don't realize for a few weeks that you've changed their heart and mind about something. And suddenly they
One,
question it.
one of the ways you do that, um, um, you know, I hate to use the word. One of the ways you deconstruct um, people's unhealthy conceptions of God and the gospel um, is with the church fathers. And so, give preachers who listen to this. give them permission to uh, put their contemporary commentaries on the shelf and pull out some pre-modern voices.
Absolutely. I would say not just permission. If you're not doing it, you're failing at what you need to do. Like you need to know what the tradition has said. And yes, the church fathers, but I would say whatever tradition has nurtured you. So for me, that was old school Pentecostals. I have a responsibility to know what the mothers and fathers of my faith have said. I am responsible for that. And that includes, of course, the mothers and fathers of the church that's shared by all of us. So that's why I'm saying church fathers. But whatever your tradition is, you need to know those voices too. So whether that's Wesley and Seymour and that's who they are for me. I'm responsible to know those. And so that's the first thing. You got to know it, and you got to walk with the saints and read the works of the saints, the lives of the saints, and the things they wrote until you have a company of friends that are kind of always accompanying you. One of the things I do in virtually every sermon is I have a saint who's my primary guide in reading those texts.
Mm.
Now, that took me years and years and years of study, and you can't just start doing that tomorrow, but you can start working toward it so that whenever you're going to be given a sermon, you want to be thinking with some saint who's read that text and or lived that story themselves. And that will change your preaching irrevocably. And I think will become much more nurturing. It gives you more confidence that you're not just making stuff up. And it keeps from being about in ways that are too small. That our lives are our lives, and so they're everything to us. But they're pretty small as witnesses to all that God is doing that people need. My life is too small to be the example to all the people I have to pastor. They need to have attention directed to Julian, Teresa, to John, to Thomas. I mean, over and over again. So that's another reason to keep company with the saints too, like to be able to point to the lives of your friends and Jesus' friends and say, well, this is how they did it. And I think one more, I almost said tactic. That might not be quite the right word, but something like tactic is know enough to be able to put counter pressure on the point you want to make. And so I was talking with a good friend just a couple of days ago, and we were talking about writing and the work of writing as sanctifying, like the actual work itself as holy and sanctifying work. And we were talking about Julie, and she has her revelations. She immediately writes them, what we know now as the quarter text. And then for years, she works on the writing and rewriting and reflecting. And then we get the longer text. And so for her, working out that revelation, that mystical vision, those mystical shewings, was writing and rewriting. And thankfully, she did write it. And even though it was lost for a long time, we've discovered it, rediscovered it, and it's nurturing for the life of the church. It's an incredible gift. But something like the opposite happens with Aquinas, where he writes and writes and writes and writes, and then at the end of his life, all that so we'll write no more, and he gives up writing. Similar thing happens with Maxima, although in his case it wasn't voluntary.
To put it mildly.
And I think what you want to do, whatever you're teaching, whatever you kind of have noticed and you want to share, what will really provide depth and dimension to your preaching is, here's the point, but there is counter pressure. Right? So this is what I hear the Lord saying for me, for us. But there's also this happening, cutting right across the grain of all that. And I think you've got to be sensitive to that, or your preaching gets too direct and too one-dimensional. And that kind of preaching is often handsy. Like you put your hands on too many people too directly. And you need some counter pressure so that everybody knows I'm saying this, and I'm saying it as directly and clearly as I can, but I haven't forgotten that God is God, that the Spirit's ways are not our ways, that God surprises us, and the Spirit is always coming out of left field. Even though I think this is true and I'm committed to it, I know it's not the whole truth. There's always more to the truth. So I think something about that, it gives breathing room to what you're
That's
saying.
similar to, yeah, like, Eugene Lowry and some of the new homiletics people in the 20th century talking about, you have to find the plot, the tension in the passage, and push on that. But there's also a plot and a tension within the interpretive tradition too. Um,
Absolutely.
but yeah, I was just reading, Cyril's commentary on Luke for Sunday, and there's a delight in his reading of scripture that you're not going to find in like Bart Ehrman. Um, you know, to take the most obvious example, but
Yeah. I hope Bart can rediscover some of the Lord help.
so Kim on here had a question about where she can find these resources, these patristic resources.
Well, in translation, I mean, all of their older translations, kind of the language is dated now, but there are lots and lots and lots of them you can find in late 1800s, early 1900s English translation. That's not a bad place to start. So like one of the places I would say is get Augustine's sermons. There are lots of good translations now of Augustine's sermons, say on the Psalms, including some that are free online. You can just Google and find. But that's a place to start. And it isn't about, just to be clear, it isn't about replicating what Augustine says. It's just knowing that he's there with you while you're reading.
Mm-hmm.
Like it will help you notice things. You're reading with a friend who lives in another time, speaks a different language, and knows God differently than you do. And like that alone is enough to kind of open your attention up a bit. So I think that's where I would start for sure. And then if you want to do it really well, of course, this is years of work, but you need to apprentice yourself to somebody who knows those saints well. So if it's going to be Augustine, say, since that's what I just picked, or Cyril and his commentaries, then find some scholars who know that work really well and just hound them with questions. Read everything they've written, find their email or their phone number, track them down, and just don't leave them alone. Right? Keep asking them questions until you start to understand. Oh, this is this. I mean, right now I'm reading Girl's commentary on John, and I'm reaching out to Andrew Louth and John Baer constantly. I'm sure they're both sick to death of hearing from me, but I don't have any doubt that they are, because I want to understand Luke better and John better. For me, means in part learning Cyril,
Mm-hmm.
and learning Cyril means spending time with the people who just know his work a lot better than I do. Until I
So
start to,
yeah, so Jordan Daniel Wood is here. So if people want to just harass him about Maximus,
yes,
just feel
I
free to
took
bother him.
Jordan should know I took his name in vain. Yesterday, I was on a podcast talking about science and faith, and talking about creation as play. So Jordan, you came up quite a bit yesterday. I had given them a piece of um, so yeah. Hopefully I didn't misrepresent you too badly.
So if folks read the sermons in this new book, All Life Comes from Tenderness, um, you do um, you speak from and about the texts consistently, um, but there's also um, Chris comes out in the sense that you are referencing poetry that has moved you and stayed with you, you know, films that are important to you, novels. So, yeah. What are you reading and watching right now?
So I'm reading the Book of the New Sun, which is a fantasy by that. It's kind of mind blowing. I'd heard people talk about it for years as really great, and so I
Look that
committed
up
to
right now.
reading. It's called The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, and someone, a good friend of mine, the other day said it's the most Catholic novel ever written, which is saying a lot, obviously. But I'm not finished with it, but so far I am loving it. The premise of it is it's a hundreds of thousands, maybe a million years in the future. Earth is dying, the sun is dying, and we're reading the story of a man who is now the ruler, the autarch, who began life as an orphan who was a torturer, and it's his story. So yeah, that's good. I'm loving that. I I do think though this question is an important one in that living in the time we live in and being shaped by the pressures we're shaped by, we're not a very imaginative group. Like we that's not something we do
Mhm.
well. And it makes us really, really poor readers. To go back to
This
some
is
of
a
the
really long book.
it is. It's 4 volumes.
Speaking of discipline.
What in the way that I'm comporting myself suggests that I would pick something easy, Jason. Like, you don't but the yeah, I think playfulness, imaginativeness has to be joined with doing the work, and that's unfortunately lost. Like we've and this is where my mean-spiritedness will come out, but we've spent so much time talking about leadership and being innovative and being relevant, and we've lost that this work that we're talking about, the work of pastoral care and preaching, is really work of a mind that has been brought down into the heart and is on fire. And but it is also childlike and playful. It's imaginative. And the preacher that doesn't love poetry or doesn't love story, I'm not saying that you couldn't also be a good pastor and a good preacher without that, but how would you ever learn to notice scripture for what it is if you don't have that sensibility? I think
Mhm.
it'd be really hard. And
Or it just even, I think one of the things that keeps me going as a pastor over the long haul is seeing certain scenes play out in the lives of people in the church and being able to recognize them as um, grace and parabolic even.
absolutely. And the key is to read well enough not to become the kind of person who plots the story rather than letting it happen. So in that conversation I mentioned yesterday about science and faith, one of the things we talked a lot about, and it's related to the point about noticing, is that we have to learn to recognize reality as it actually happens. And unfortunately, most of us are conditioned to live predictively, like to kind of
Mhm.
get control of reality by figuring out its algorithm and mastering it in that way. But actually, that's you can't do that. And the way we're meant to live is to recognize reality as it actually appears to us. Here it is, it's happening. And so that comment you made about Teresa and her levitation, that's what I mean. We're conditioned to kind of edit out, to bracket out automatically without thinking any stuff that doesn't fit our algorithm, that doesn't fit
Yeah.
the the stuff we've been told that matters. Everything else just kind of automatically, thoughtlessly gets worked out, framed out. And you're that's inhuman. You cannot care for people well from that place. Whether you're a pastor or not, you can't care for people well from that place. And so the key is to cultivate, what Vey calls attention, what I'm now calling recognition, what earlier you called noticing. And for Christians, I think that begins in the way you read the scriptures and the way you tell the story of the saints, and then in the way that you testify about your own story and the way you listen to the stories of the people around you. And to learn to recognize that there is a plot there, but not to think you know what has to happen because you have a preconceived notion of how plots work.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
each story is different. And so I think somehow having a sense of story without having such a narrow mechanical sense of story that you can't recognize what's actually happening in your life or in the lives of others or in the text itself. And let me give you two examples of that in terms of reading. One is, so our shorthand ways of referring to the parables of Jesus are almost always a sign that we haven't read.
They're terrible. Well, for that matter, like the headings of every passage in most translations of the Bible are wrong.
Absolutely right. And they're wrong because we don't read well. So think about this one, the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's not a parable about the Good Samaritan. I mean, Jesus says, a man went down and was waylaid by robbers and left half dead. And then he ends by saying, from which of these did that man receive mercy? It's a story about a man who needed mercy, who was again waylaid and left for dead and received mercy. It's not a story about the person that showed mercy. It's a story he needed mercy. And it does show up someone who gave him mercy. But it's not a story about the Good Samaritan. It's a story about him in mercy.
Yeah.
That's an obvious thing, but isn't obvious to us because we've labeled this story a certain way that keeps us from seeing it. And the even worse example, or the even more egregious failure, is the parable of the prodigal son. It's not a parable, right? And so on. And so some of it is kind of unlearning what we think the text says. Again, learning to notice, learning to recognize. And I think reading good novels, watching good movies, reading good poetry should be training our attention to broadening our capacity to notice what's happening.
Yeah.
And
For
that's
the
one.
Iowa Preachers Project, we had a poet do an exercise with the preachers, and so there was, I can't remember the name of the practice, but to look at a piece of art and write a brief poem about it, and he challenged them to see what is not in the frame, and so and I was thinking about the parable of the prodigal son in that spirit, and I'm like, well, where's the wife, the mother?
Yes.
She's not there. Yeah. So
I think you can, and we're back to an earlier part of the conversation, but I think if you can notice what you notice and notice what it makes you feel, you can start to discern what your deep heart knows to be true that you haven't been able to name yet. So you can kind of work back from, okay, I'm noticing this. And when I notice that, I realize I'm feeling this. Where's that coming from? Why? And when you can answer that question, you probably are getting really close to, oh, this is something I've known that I haven't said out loud, that I haven't acknowledged yet. And that's whatever that is, that's the place from which nourishing, healing sermons come from.
Hmm. So, because I trust your aesthetic, tell me a movie I should watch. Film.
We talked about this recently. This summer I've had no chance to watch anything. What's the last thing I've watched that's interesting? Hmm. Well, you tell me first while I'm trying to gather a thought. I can't even remember the last movie I saw.
Oh, yeah, I don't know that I can either, actually. So, okay,
I,
well,
probably my favorite distraction. For me, it's more than distraction. But if I have time, oh, I know. The last movie I saw in theaters was the Brad Pitt uh, racing movie.
okay.
Nothing insightful to hear about that. Right. But I'm pretentious, but I'm not pretentious enough to turn that movie.
I did on a plane ride um for a vacation. I did rewatch Pig, the Nicolas Cage movie.
So great. I'll tell you what I had. Yeah, that's plane ride. So I was on a flight. This was an overseas flight, and to Iona, and Babette's Feast was one of the options,
Huh.
and it got me. I mean, I of course turned it on, and if those who haven't seen it, watch that movie. Watch that movie, Babette's Feast. But it it got me thinking about what's that movie doing on an overseas flight? Like, why is Delta choosing Babette's to be on a flight? And I think this is what hit me. And those who've seen the movie will know why. I think there is a growing hunger to return to simpler, smaller, slower ways of life.
Hmm.
There just isn't a film that does a better job of showing us the wonder, the glory of slow, small, simple ways of life. There are others that do wonders too, but none better than that film. And the ways in which you can draw together slowness and simplicity and smallness with extravagant gift. And that's the one I would say. If you haven't seen it, see it. If you have seen it, think about the fact that that's now one of the films that people can watch on an overseas flight. And I think that tells us something that there is like people are sensing we've got to change gears. We've got to
Hmm.
shift. We've got to shift to slower and smaller. And
Speaking of slower and smaller, have you read the kind of the philosophical commentary on Terrence Malick's films?
oh, of course, yes. I mean, unfortunately, yeah, I have a couple of books in which I talk about. I mean, of course, All Things Beautiful. There's a chapter dedicated to him, and then a couple other smaller essays that I've written. One of the things I'm proudest of in life. This tells you a lot about my life. It someone actually gave him a copy of those pieces that I had written about his film, and his personal assistant had written back to me to say that Terry had read them and was encouraged by them. So first,
I'm so jealous.
yeah, me too. I feel like I'm delighted to think that he read the pieces that I wrote about him, but also I wonder what does he was encouraged by them mean? Like it, I don't know. It's not the compliment I would have picked for myself if I could have written it for him. But I guess they,
So yeah, you you end the book with these words. Um, to call Jesus Lord is to say that he serves us and does so perfectly. That when his work is said and done, we are perfect just as God is perfect. In the end, Christ is our refuge because we are his joy and delight. We are not only why he prayed, we are the answer to his prayer. Believe it. So I hope people get your book, Chris. It's available now, right?
it is, and it'll be if it's not already, it'll be available as an ebook for those who can't order the paperback. But yeah, thank you, Jason. Thanks for being who you are and engaging this. Thanks for the endorsement, for the conversation around it. I mean, it's a gift. Your friendship is a gift. Thank you.
Same, same. Are you going to do that thing in Kansas again this coming year?
I think it's going to end up being the first part of next year, but yes, I'll be there.
Cool. Okay. All right. And now that I know you're in Oklahoma, I have to go visit Top Littleton. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
We'll do all together from somewhere in Tuttle.
But again, it's All Life Comes from Tenderness. Check it out.
Thank you, Jason.
Yep.
See you.